What's up guys, Sagi here and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. Today I'm going to give you 5 tips that are going to help you improve your M50 photography. I know that a lot of you use this camera for photos and you're always looking to get better and better images, but you're not really sure where to start. So I put together 5 tips that are really going to get you on your way to taking better photos, plus 1 power tip, and I even have a special bonus download which I'll get to at the end. I also want to mention that I have a link to my complete M50 playlist in the description. So if you love this camera and you want to see all my reviews, tutorials, and comparisons, go ahead and check it out. All right, let's get started. And my first tip for improving your M50 photography is to shoot RAW and JPEG. If you've heard the term RAW before and were either unsure what it meant or were intimidated by it, let's break it down. RAW is a file format that captures all of the image data recorded by the sensor when you take a photo. A JPEG is simply a compressed version of the RAW data, which results in smaller file sizes that are easier to manage and share. Well, let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of both formats. RAW files, for example, will give you many more shades of each color. So an 8-bit JPEG will give you approximately 16.8 million colors, whereas a 14-bit RAW image, like what you get from the M50, will give you 4.4 trillion colors. Now, in addition, you're also getting a wider dynamic range and color gamut compared to a JPEG image. If you simply looked at both photos side by side, you may not be able to see a significant difference depending on your monitor. But as you start editing and manipulating the image, you'll see that with a RAW file, you get a significantly better detail and color recovery from highlights and shadows. Another important advantage of RAW images is that you can change things like white balance, brightness, contrast, and saturation in a non-destructive way. So for example, if you shot a photo with the wrong white balance, when you open the RAW image for editing, you'll actually get a drop-down where you can select the correct white balance and then the image will immediately correct itself. Now let's get to the advantages of JPEG files. So JPEG images are fully processed and compressed in camera, so things like white balance, saturation, tonal curve, and sharpening are already baked in. So instead of having to edit every image, you have an image that's ready to be posted or shared. You can still make adjustments to it, obviously, you're just not getting as much flexibility as you would when editing a RAW file. The reason why I say shoot in both is that you'll have the best of both worlds. When you nail the exposure and the white balance, you'll have a JPEG that's ready to be shared. And if you need to make some more significant adjustments, you can always open the RAW file and start your edit from there. Now, both formats also have disadvantages to them, and I'll discuss them in a full dedicated video for RAW versus JPEG. Next, I want to move to tip number 2, which is to use the proper focus method and operation. So the M50 has 3 focus methods: 1-point autofocus, zone autofocus, and face detection plus tracking. 1-point autofocus should be used when you want precise control over where the M50 will get focused. I use this when I photograph landscapes, architecture, or stationary objects, and I want to choose exactly what I want in focus. Zone autofocus lets you select a larger zone and then rely on the camera to pick what to focus on. This can be really helpful if the subject is moving really fast and you don't have time to get the focus point placed exactly over it. But of course you have much less control because you're counting on the M50 to choose. Next, we have face detection and tracking, which is the mode that I use the most. In this mode, the M50 will automatically detect faces, track them, and keep them in focus as they move through the frame. You can also activate eye detection by making sure you first have autofocus method set to face detection plus tracking, and then going to menu, shoot 6, eye detection autofocus, and select enable. This will give you an extra level of accuracy because it will keep the eye closest to the camera in focus rather than using the whole face. The eye is the most important part because that's where the viewer tends to look first when they're looking at a portrait. Now let's move to autofocus operation, and this is where we get to choose between one-shot AF and servo AF. One-shot AF means that you get focus by pressing the shutter halfway down, and then the focus is locked. You can then wait until you're ready to shoot and continue to press the shutter all the way down, which will take the picture. This works really well when you're shooting subjects that are stationary or even for portrait sessions where the subject is fairly stationary. But what happens if you lock the focus and then the person takes a step or 2 steps forward, or they move backwards before you take the picture? With one-shot AF, if you continue to press the button, you'll take a picture where the subject is out of focus. If you want to regain focus, you'll have to let go, press the button halfway down, and then fully press it. If you change AF operation to servo AF, the M50 will continue to focus on the subject for as long as you press the button halfway down. So even if the subject keeps moving closer and farther away from the camera, the M50 will keep getting focus so that whenever you press the button, the subject will be in focus. You can use servo AF even for portraits, but in that case you lose eye detection and will need to rely on face detection. So if I'm trying to capture a kid that's running all over the place and not really staying still, I may choose to use servo AF, whereas if I'm doing a portrait session and the subject is cooperating, I'll use one-shot AF. All right, so now let's move to tip number 3 for better pictures, and that's to shoot in manual mode. The M50 is a great camera and it could do so much, and yet so many people use it in automatic mode, which Canon calls P. If you're in a rush and you just need to get the picture, that's just fine. But I really encourage you to learn how to manually get the proper exposure. It doesn't mean that you always need to use it, but it does mean that if you're using full auto mode or even aperture or shutter priority and you're not getting the results that you want, you'll know exactly what adjustments you need to make. I have a video that explains how to get a proper exposure, and I'll link to it up in the corner and in the description. It's one of the first videos that I ever made, so you should go check it out and get a good laugh. I'm almost finished with an updated video which will walk you step by step through how to finally get off auto mode and get the most out of your M50. Now before I move on, if you like what you've seen so far and feel like you've gotten value from this video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. It helps the video and the channel, and it lets me know what kind of content you like so that I can make more of it. And if it's your first time here, hit the subscribe and notification buttons to stay up to date on all the latest gear and tutorials. All right, on to tip number 4, which is great for users who like to shoot in live view, meaning using the LCD instead of the viewfinder. This is a feature that not a lot of people know about unless they accidentally activate it, and I'm talking about touch shutter. So if you look at the bottom left of your LCD, you'll see a little icon showing a hand touching the screen. If you see the word off, it means that this feature is disabled. And if you don't see any word and instead you see an arrow pointing down at the shutter, that means that you can click anywhere on the LCD and the M50 will get focus and take a picture. So if you like using the LCD to take pictures, this is much faster than selecting a focus point by touching the screen and then going and pressing the actual shutter button, and you're much less likely to miss your shot. You can activate this feature via the LCD like I showed you, or you can go into the menu, shoot 5, touch shutter, and turn it to enable. And since we're already on this page, let's also look at touch and drag autofocus settings. This is a feature that lets you use your left thumb on the screen and it will move the autofocus point and even select a subject for tracking. If you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it. It's an awesome user experience and it's much easier and faster to move the autofocus point to exactly where you want it. All right, now we're moving to tip number 5, then I'll give you my power tip, and then we'll get to the free download. So tip number 5 is to invest in lenses. If you watched my how to choose your first lens video, you know why I always recommend that essentially every person start out by getting the kit lens. In the case of the M50, we're talking about the 15 to 45mm lens. But as you grow as a photographer, you're likely to get to the point where you want things like better low light performance, the ability to get shallower depth of field. You may want to zoom in on something that's far away or take macro shots of subjects that are really close up. Or you may just want better overall image quality. And in these cases, you'll want to look at some additional lens options. With the addition of the Sigma 16-30 and 56mm f1.4 lenses, we now have some pretty great lenses to choose from in the EFM line. I have a dedicated video about my favorite EFM lines, but I'll give you a couple of my favorites here. And if you want to see the rest, I'll leave a link up in the corner and in the description. For portraits, my favorite lens, hands down, is the Sigma 56mm f1.4. This lens produces incredible image quality. I can get great separation from the background. It's compact, it's light, it's really an outstanding lens. You rarely hear me be so definitive about a product, but if you want to shoot portraits with your M50 and you can afford $449, which I know is not cheap, I just can't see you regretting buying this lens. I have L series Canon glass, which we'll get to in a minute, but when I use my M50 for portraits, unless I want the zoom of a 24-70 f2.8 or the 70-200 f2.8, I always grab this 56mm. The next situation where I find myself reaching for a different lens in the kit lens is when I want a wide lens with good low light performance. And in that case, I always choose between the Canon 22mm f2 and the Sigma 16mm f1.4. If I want the most compact and lightest setup, the Canon 22mm is an excellent choice. It's a great lens for street photography or for a small gimbal. If size and weight aren't a primary concern and instead I want a wider angle of view and an even larger maximum aperture, then the Sigma 16mm f1.4 is my go-to lens. I use this lens with both my Canon APS-C and my Sony APS-C cameras, and of course I use the E-mount version for Sony. And again, if this lens is in your budget, I highly recommend it. Like I said, I have a video dedicated to EFM lenses where I go much more in depth into each lens. So if you're interested, check it out when you're finished with this one. All right, so now I want to get to my power tip, which actually ties into tip number 5 because it has to do with lenses. Now, a lot of people who use the M50 already had Canon lenses from previous Canon DSLRs, or they're interested in those EF and EFS lenses because there are some incredible lenses at different price points. And if that's something that you plan to do, I highly recommend that you look into an adapter and a speed booster. Both will allow you to attach lenses designed for DSLRs onto your M50, but a speed booster has additional functions as an effective focal length reducer and increasing the lens's speed by a stop of light for better low light performance. Both will open the door to an extensive selection of lenses from Canon and third-party providers and will give you tons of lens options at virtually any price point. I just finished a video explaining what adapters and speed boosters do, as well as a detailed look at crop factor, so if that's something that you're interested, definitely check it out. I'll put a link up in the corner and in the description. Okay, so now let's get to the download, and this has to do with how I edit my photos. Usually when I do a shoot, I have a lot of photos that look similar because I'm in the same space. And instead of having to edit each one of them, I choose to make a preset. So what I'll do is get one image to look how I want, and then I'll create a preset and then apply it to all the images from the same location to get a consistent look. I then also use those presets when I want to post a few pictures to Instagram and I don't want to start from scratch with each new edit. So I put together a free pack of presets that you can use on your desktop and mobile device, and I'll put a link to the download page down in the description. Feel free to use them on your personal or commercial images, doesn't matter, they're my gift to you for being part of the channel. All right, so these were my 5 tips for improving your M50 photography. I guess it was technically 6 tips if I'm counting the power tip, but anyways, I hope you found them helpful. I'll put links in the description to the videos that I talked about, as well as the complete M50 playlist, so you can see everything that I put together for you. I'll also include links to where you can buy the M50, as well as some of the lenses and accessories that I mentioned, and there are always holiday specials and discounts. Those links will be updated with the lowest prices. I really hope I was able to give you some good tips on improving your M50 photography. And if I did, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can always find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.